Justin, thank you for being here, mate.
Happy to be here.
I
Thanks for
wanted to
inviting me.
start off with taking a little quote out of an essay that you wrote a couple of years ago that kind of struck me, and I thought it would be quite cool to get you to expand on what you meant by it. So it goes, hence the need for a fundamentally anti-bourgeois revolutionary intellectual culture, cold enough to seek all the darkest truths, but still warm enough not to betray the calling of solidarity. What were you thinking when you wrote that?
I think that compassion is, you must recall, a defining aspect of left-wing personality traits if you look at it empirically. Compassion is great for a lot of reasons, and it's an important part of the human condition, and one that should be retained. It's valuable and important. It's also a drawback. It also has costs or pitfalls. And I think this is just not understood, that compassion has trade-offs. There are good things and bad things about compassion. And one of the worst aspects of compassion is that it can be blinding. It can be blinding to what is real, to what is true. And that is how I would diagnose one of the kind of foundational problems or shortcomings of the contemporary political left, is that compassion has become too primary. And if you prioritize compassion above all else, you're pretty much doomed to having a just absolutely useless empirical model of how things actually work. And if you don't have a reasonably rigorous mental model of how things actually work, then you're technically precisely incapable of changing anything about how things work. You're just going to be kind of, spinning your wheels and burning fuel, trying to create manipulations on the world that go nowhere, that just repeatedly fail to produce the changes that you want to see or that you hope to see. And that is what I was thinking when I wrote that line that you quoted. To my mind, if you want to have a real revolutionary left that is able to fundamentally overthrow institutions, you need to have other priorities and values that counterbalance compassion. It can't be compassion all the way down. You need a good dose of coldness, of analytical coldness, and confidently, coolly looking straight in the face whatever the actual situation is. And that's often a horrifying situation. It's often a painful situation. Certain people don't have certain abilities. Certain people are stuck in particular ruts that it's quite painful and sad to confront that. But if we want to have any chance of actually militantly overthrowing the dominant order of injustice and inequality that we see in the world today, that leftists compassionately want to change, if you want to have any chance of that, you need to at least have some people on your team. It can be different people. I'm not saying individuals have to have both a perfect balance of compassion and coldness, because that's not likely. People do have different personality traits, but you do need to have, at least on your team, a certain balance of compassion and cold analytical rigor, at least across people. And so what I was putting forward at that time, and then some other writings to that effect, is basically that what I think the revolutionary left would really want is to just have at least some people who are allowed to engage in a kind of brutal analytical coldness. That would be the case that I would make. It's like, you don't have to like analytical coldness. You can find it icky to talk about human differences, for instance. That's fine. You don't have to. But at least allow a few people on your team to take up that somewhat cold, painful area of analysis and research to actually figure out what a meaningful left could and should do concretely.
And is the issue at the moment with a lot of the bourgeois academic culture, as I think you'd phrase it, that it plays too strongly towards this care and compassion and shying away from some of the coldness and the analyticalness, and also thinkers who might be considered uncomfortable or unsavory?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also worth noting that pure compassion, not counterbalanced by any type of analytical rigor, actually becomes its own type of cruelty. And this is the perverse kind of paradoxical effects that we're seeing today with the contemporary radical left. a lot of the right wingers look at the contemporary radical left that we see in the streets today, and think that it's basically this kind of like disingenuous cabal of resentful left wingers who actually just use the vocabulary of compassion as a thin veneer to basically hide what is their true underlying nature of murder and violence and wanting to steal from the rich. And this is I think a popular mental model that right wingers see of the left. And I don't think that's actually accurate. I do think that the overwhelming majority of the left-wing militants you're seeing today, engaging in pretty, I think, ridiculous and quite destructive norms and behaviors, they are actually in the heart of hearts pursuing compassion. They're compassionate people. They're genuinely upset at the sight of unjust police killings of Black people. They're genuinely upset at the existence of homelessness and perverse inequalities. These things genuinely cause them real pain because they are genuinely really compassionate people, and they do want to overthrow unjust structures out of a sense of compassion. But what you're seeing paradoxically is that if it's just compassion on steroids, nothing else balancing it out, no other competing values or priorities within an organization or a movement, you're actually going to get really perverse kind of psychotic and eventually destructive and cruel phenomena, such as the witch hunts that you're seeing today, such as the kind of sacrificial victims that you're seeing today, and all of the weird, somewhat like Stalin-esque formations that can emerge in the contemporary left today. That it is possible that compassion is essentially at the core of that, and that's how I am inclined to read it.
Justin, how do you connect this inclination towards compassion with the way that the market and capitalism, also known as woke capitalism today, tries to recuperate that and integrate that into a project that in many ways sounds accelerationist?
Maybe you could say a little bit more about it. Sounds like you have a thesis in there, but you phrased that as a question. I would much rather hear your thesis.
That's a good reply. Well, let's drop the accelerationism outside of it first. What do you think are the main things that woke capitalism tries to integrate from this proclivity to compassion?
Right. So the way I see this is that you have these extremely compassionate people who are kind of hijacked by their own compassion. As I said before, they're pursuing techniques of social manipulation, techniques of building what they would say as building a social movement. They're pursuing action on the world. They're trying to change the world around them, but because they're so gung-ho on compassion and they prohibit cold analytical rigor, it's what I said before. They're constantly failing to produce the results that they want on the world. They're constantly basically producing effects that they fundamentally were not expecting and fundamentally did not want, because they're operating in a false model of the world that's terribly kind of distorted and biased by just the sheer compassion. And what happens is woke capital, what is called woke capital, for people listening who don't know what we're referring to exactly, that's basically the kind of co-option of wokeness by corporations, and you see it more and more now. Right now, I mean, we are in June 2020. We are in a high water mark for this with the Black Lives Matter. The woke capital is really ticking up a notch. It's rather remarkable. What's going on there is, guess what? Someone is stepping in to provide the analytical coldness that the left is not able to provide for itself. That's exactly how I would interpret it. In other words, you could imagine a radical left where there's a bunch of compassionate people, but then they allow people like me to kind of say provocative, transgressive things that are maybe really hard to hear and uncomfortable to hear, and they sound kind of cruel or something like that. But they see that someone like me is genuinely interested in the same kind of emancipatory social transformations that they want. So they allow people like me to do the analytical coldness. And I can, run my digital businesses, and I can say provocative, transgressive, cold analytical truths. I can do these kinds of cold analytical types of practices and behaviors in support of, in cooperation with the social movements for social justice. That is a totally viable possibility. That's kind of my vision of the radical left. You bring in your own coldness people to do the tasks of coldness that no one in the compassionate wing of the left wants to do. And in that way, you can build a real ship that can sail and actually produce desirable, predictable ripples on the social fabric. But because people like me are not allowed in the left, even though I'm like a genuine leftist in pretty much every way, I have some kind of culturally conservative leanings, but at the end of the day, I'm basically on board with what all of the rioters want and what all of the current kind of social justice types want. At the end of the day, I want the same kind of justice and equality. I'm motivated to get that, like they are. So they could let me on their team. They could allow me to remain like a member of the left. People like me are not allowed on the left. We're called like alt-right. I'm called alt-right or whatever. But they could allow me to be on their team and to do some of the coldness functions. But they don't want that. So by pushing out all people on their team who are willing to do the coldness functions, woke capital swoops in and manipulates the fuck out of them. And they have no kind of engineering defenses against this. They have no mimetic or operational way to prevent that at all. And so that's how I would connect the diagnosis of compassion with the woke capital phenomenon.
Very cool. I love that you talked about
Alexander Bard
go ahead,
put out a tweet yesterday that I've been thinking about a lot, which was something along the lines of the issue with the idea of systemic racism is that it assumes that class conflict is the outcome of racism, as opposed to racism being the outcome of class conflict. It's kind of a mistaken order of causality there. And I find it very interesting to be thinking through it. I think the way in which woke capital, the values of the protests we're seeing today are so easily adopted by big business, and indeed by the kind of wealthiest and most elite among society. And these businesses that could very much at the same time be a clothing company exploiting workers out in Bangladesh, but are putting on their Instagram page and on their Twitter pages, we support Black Lives Matter. We want racial equality here. There's this way that it's like a screen to hide behind. You can hide the exploitative nature of the capital relations and just point to the racial conflicts, which are, I think, second order effects of that. As a way, I can get out of jail free card. It's like we're on the right side and we don't have to change anything.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying.
And I wonder if, as well, often well-meaning people like the memes without having to really get their hands dirty. You were talking about there's compassion is the supreme value, say, on a lot of the left. But if they're not willing to do the analytical rigor and indeed get the hands dirty, where do we go?
Feels like limbic capitalism takes advantage of woke capitalism and of people's proclivity towards A, B, or C. That might be maybe compassion. That might be maybe a revolutionary project. But limbic capitalism recuperates it all. That was kind of my point a while ago with the accelerationism idea, with the idea that the market is so all-encompassing that it will end up eating everything, even its own critique.
Right. Well, all of the increasing kind of insanity of the social justice politics, I mean, that is accelerationism. It's part and parcel with accelerationism. It's these people's emotions are being supercharged and hijacked at an accelerating rate that they don't even fully understand. And the way that woke capital kind of swoops in and works perfectly well with it. This is all acceleration. This is everyone being pulled into circuits of kind of energy and exchange that they don't even fully process, that they can't even fully process, because in fact the mechanisms are above their heads. It's operating at a more complex level than they're even able to compute. And that complex level is essentially the artificial intelligence that is global capitalism. I mean, global capitalism is pulling the strings. And when you look at the social justice warrior types, like those people are essentially following orders that have already been laid out in front of them by woke capital. Not woke capital as agents, like if you not like the CEOs of corporations are pulling these strings. It's not that. It's that the global market order is specifying what needs to happen next, what should happen next. And these the social justice activists are really just obeying the orders of what is rational for them to obey, frankly, for the types of people that they are. They're not able to compute the circuits of causality within which they're actually operating and contributing.
Let's dissect that, because that's hitting the nail on the head. I saw in one of your videos when you were talking about Deleuze about this becoming imperceptible, of trying to enact a project that is not yet discursified. Now, what we see a lot of the people doing today is using the means that have already been laid out for them by, say, capital and the march of capital in many ways. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how, what's the project behind woke capital? We know, I think it was Deleuze or Reliant who called it thanatropic machinism, meaning that it's this dead, as a non-living machine desire progressing throughout history and deterritorializing things. Do you have any thoughts on the nature of this capital, on the nature of the relations that capital presupposes? What is it? Who is it? What does it want?
Well, in some ways, I think that particular agents operating within capitalism don't really know what capitalism wants in an ultimate sense. The ultimate teleology is kind of in its nature unclear to us. Now, I have a very unique and idiosyncratic perspective on this because I'm a Christian. Or, you could say I'm a Christian because I have an idiosyncratic reading of this accelerationist phenomenon that leads me to believe in a kind of Christian eschatology. In my view, the accelerationist framework really does point to the rationality and the legitimacy of a essentially Christian eschatology, because in my view, it is a fact that where exactly capitalism is going, what exactly capitalism is optimizing for in the long run sense, we really don't know. And it's a true kind of cosmological mystery. And to me, it's actually the Christian eschatology that best reflects that. Like, the Christian eschatology actually seems to be one of the most compelling and realistic descriptive models for actually what is the situation we're facing. That's becoming increasingly clear in this kind of postmodern digital context that we're all living in the 2020s. And so that's frankly how I see it. In other words, when all we know as agents is that we have these kind of rational sticks and carrots in front of us, right? And we are limited creatures. We can only see so far because global capitalism is literally a kind of complex computational machinery that is doing calculations at a level that we can't understand. So the price mechanism, for instance, if you just look at how prices function in society, the price of a good or service changes due to a large number of social interactions that are happening away from me, right? So I might look at a market and see the price of something rising or falling. That's literally a signal being transmitted to me, one person, based on a large number of interactions that are happening in places I can't see, right? So capitalism, and just to use the price mechanism as an example of capitalism, I think it's kind of the best concrete kind of way to imagine what capitalism really is as a kind of signaling system, kind of ordering around the behaviors of human individuals. If you think about the price mechanism in this way, then all I get is a signal of what type of good or service there should be more of or there should be less of. And this is information about how I can increase my chances of survival, how I can, pay my own way to survive in life, right? So it's this very limited context that any individual or entity sees. And this applies also for CEOs of corporations, right? All the way up, no matter how smart you are. Even people with, supercomputers can't compute what global capitalism is computing in some non-trivial sense over and above all of our heads. So we get these little signals, right? And where does it go? It's literally beyond our capacities to compute. And in a technical way, in a technical sense. And to me, that's very, very convergent with what a lot of the religious traditions have thought of as God. I mean, with global capitalism in its highly developed, advanced state that we have today, it is literally true that there is a kind of agent, even though it's a system, it's not really, capitalism is not a person. There is, in some sense, a type of entity or agent that is above all of our heads, pulling the strings in ways that we don't fully understand. I mean, if that's not what people have in mind when they talk about God throughout the ages in different religious traditions, then I can't imagine what would be a more kind of realistic and concrete kind of manifestation or evidence that something like a God does exist in the world. I'm not saying that capitalism is God. I would not say that. However, there's something going on there that hasn't really been figured out, and that's kind of that's one of my research agendas. I currently think of it as something more like capitalism is this kind of autonomous increasing of intelligence in the universe itself. It's something like that. It's like capitalism is the universe trying to grow, like the universe intrinsically growing its own intelligence. And we are but pawns in that process of the universe basically becoming more and more intelligent. And global capitalism, the way that it's able to order our behaviors, is basically using us as pawns to make itself more intelligent. And I think you can translate that into, I mean, that's a pretty scientific narrative. Lots of AI experts would, more or less, could more or less agree with something like that. You could get on board with something like that. And I think you can translate that essentially into the Christian eschatology, in which God kind of created the universe, and then through us, God kind of develops or unfolds over time. And yeah, I think that's not at all provocative. That's not at all even crazy or controversial. So that's how I see it. I don't know if that gives you any. I don't know if that's at all satisfying for you, but that's how I see it.
Brilliant. That's precisely where we wanted to take this conversation. Cheeky follow-up, very short. Is it God or is it the Antichrist?
Right. Great question. Yeah. So this is the major problem. And again, this is where I think the Christian eschatology is really useful, because in the Christian eschatology, there is this kind of eternal battle, right, between good and evil. And it sure as hell kind of looks to me like a lot of individuals are increasingly kind of captured by a kind of satanic process that they don't fully understand. And so is capitalism God or is capitalism Satan, right? And I'm inclined to think, the way that I think about it is, if we use the term capitalism or the capitalist system as basically a placeholder for instrumental rationality, more or less, is what is really at stake, I think. And that's really what I would urge people to drill down into. Instrumental rationality is Satan, and capitalism is essentially what emerges when everyone is operating according to instrumental rationality. Capitalism is kind of like the generalization of instrumental rationality as the defining norm for what individuals should do, what society ought to look like. For those who are listening who maybe don't know what I'm talking about, instrumental rationality is pretty much just when you're trying to basically optimize for a particular desirable outcome, and you're trying to do that as effectively or as efficiently as possible. So capitalism, in other words, it's the defining rationality of modernity, of capitalism, basically trying to get as much stuff as you can from the least amount of input. It's efficiency, essentially, in some ways. It's a calculating kind of approach to rationality. Now, as people like Max Weber, the famous sociologist, pointed out and analyzed this in detail, there are other forms of rationality throughout time and space. There have been societies and contexts in which other types of rationality have prevailed. And one is what he calls ethical substantive rationality. And that's pretty much where you have a kind of commitment to a particular ethical value, which is categorical. It's non-negotiable. It's not calculable. There is no price that you could pay me to deviate from this ethical value commitment. And Weber shows that this is a kind of rationality. Like, it's not an irrational type of kind of exception to the rule of rationality. It is its own kind of rationality. There is a logic to why. There's a rationality to why one should have certain values that are non-negotiable, that are absolutely exempt from the rational calculus of the give and take and the negotiations of instrumental rationality. And of course, the religious traditions are one of the major kind of defenders of these kind of traditional ethical substantive rationalities. So in my mental model of this larger question, it's like capitalism as the generalization of instrumental rationality is essentially the instrumental rationality part is essentially Satan. That's like Mephistopheles. That is the temptation to just get more and more goods, right? Get more and more for yourself. The kind of satanic notion that you can have done with God, that you can have done with core ethical value commitments that constrain the maximization of pleasure or whatever the case might be. So what we're watching right now is the increasing takeoff of instrumental rationality as such, as the only kind of defining norm of society. So it sure does look like society, like Western civilization, is basically shooting off into its utter demise via kind of satanic capitulation. And I think that's why there's a lot of conspiracy theories right now around satanic pedophile cults among the powerful and the elites, right? I think that's not accidental. And so I totally recognize I'm kind of going way off on many different tangents, but I'm trying to kind of bring it back together for you. Basically, the way that I ultimately come down on this, I think, is that there is a necessity to retain ethical kind of substantive ethical rationality, where we have certain values that we commit to without negotiation, without any compromise, and that refuse to be bought off. To me, like, this is the Christian calling in the accelerationist context, is to have core values that you won't compromise on, no matter how much money people are willing to throw at you. And to me, the main one is the truth as such. And this brings us back to coldness and analytical, to the analytical coldness that is necessary for society to really function. That's a very, very Christian imperative. It's very explicit in the Christian narrative. One should tell the truth at all costs, no matter what, and to never deviate on that. To me, that's kind of the solution, if you ask me, to navigating this kind of accelerating situation that we're in, which is stick to the truth no matter what. Don't allow any instrumental temptations that capitalism provides to send you off course of the truth. Have a kind of substantive, ethical, rational commitment to the truth at all costs. And if enough people do this, I think you get to the kingdom of heaven. Or I think even if it's just an individual does this by themselves and they're killed for it, or they're martyred or whatever, or canceled, right? If that individual just sticks to the truth and nothing else, then that person finds the kingdom of heaven. That person enters the kingdom of heaven. And you can debate what that means. I personally don't believe in any kind of, supernatural things. I think there is a understanding of this concept of the kingdom of heaven. The whole point, what Jesus says, is like to bring the kingdom of heaven down to earth. So I think that if you really commit to the truth, absolutely, and in a non-conditional, non-compromising way, you really do have this unique kind of power emerges to actually create a kind of kingdom of heaven on earth for you and the people around you, and possibly for other people who do this. And I think if you can communicate this idea and other people can do it, then you can expand that kingdom of heaven and possibly allow it to kind of take over. But if you don't commit to the truth and you just capitulate to instrumental rationality, which is what capitalism generalizes, then you get what we have today, which is a kind of increasingly chaotic and horrifying trajectory for civilization as a whole. And those and people who just submit to instrumental rationality, that's literally, I think, submitting to Satan. That's essentially the Faustian bargain. Most people today in modern society have made this Faustian bargain. They've gained extraordinary power for themselves to do things and have pleasure and different types of earthly power, but they've literally obtained it through a bargaining with the devil, where they have basically sacrificed something like truth-telling, for instance, in order to get power, and that is just a path straight to hell. And I think there are a lot of people who are on a path straight to hell, and I think our civilization, in many ways, is on a path straight to hell. But this is all said, and this is literally what the Christian eschatology says. Is that this is what will happen. So I know I'm totally ranting like crazy, but I think that is a fairly comprehensive statement of my view. And you did ask, so you get what you asked for.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Love the rant, man.
there's something that caught my attention when you were speaking, and truth in itself was one of the first things to be attacked by Nietzsche, by the death of God and authority itself, with the wars of the 20th century and the dissolution of previous forms of colonial patriarchy, which was based on a truth, a previous truth in itself, an authority as such. And then as postmodernism and now the digital age move forward, obviously that's precisely the feels like a red herring at this point. Rather, you could put 10 people in a room talking about truth and all agreeing in principle that they will search for truth and they will not reach an agreement by the end on which they can operate and sustain a base of operation. So it feels like truth is a process. And you're a Deleuzian, you know that it's not a philosophy, that one of the interesting things is not philosophies of things as such, rather philosophies of how things become, of the processes. So I don't know if you're aware of Heidegger's notion, which also maps precisely to Christian eschatology, namely the 1,000-year rule of the Antichrist before the second coming, which Heidegger talks on the question of technology about this idea where as technology grows and grows in power and it encompasses the whole world, so does the saving power simultaneously increase until a moment where at the midnight hour, there's going to be an inversion, kind of a deus ex machina, which is necessitated in principle by, the scapegoating event of Christ dying on the cross and our vicarious being saved by him. There's that, and there's always the smirk of Mephistopheles saying, yeah, but I can hijack that at any moment. And that's I think that ties so precisely with accelerationism, which is, what does accelerationism seek with this? Destruction or salvation?
Hell yeah. This is very well put. Yeah, that's the eternal question. And, there's this idea of, don't immanentize the eschaton. And I think that's kind of what you're helping to do right now. Is, it always seems that we are heading towards this kind of eschatological turning point. It has always seemed like that to people at all times, right? And it's important to remember that that's the case, and that our particular time is probably not as exceptional as it might feel to us. And I think you pretty much captured that in your comment, which was very apropos, that this is a kind of eternal struggle, and there is this kind of profound existential uncertainty as to where things ultimately go. And if there is that kind of last minute inversion, as you very nicely put it, but I follow here a kind of Kierkegardian attitude in which the Christian position is to basically admit that profound uncertainty and ambiguity, and to say, nonetheless, I choose to adopt the affirmative position. I choose to have faith in the affirmative position for many different reasons. I think you can have a lot of discussions about why that is the right choice and why that is a good choice, or why that is an aesthetically pleasing choice. There are many different ways you can think about that, or justify that, or talk about that. But ultimately, it is a kind of leap of faith, and it is a kind of very personal, essentially kind of obscure and mysterious confrontation with the absolute uncertainty of the outside, that one has to kind of make that decision by oneself without a handrail, without any kind of guardrail. And that's essentially the existentialist plateau, if you will. And that comes through, of course, Kierkegaard. And it's essentially a kind of Christian attitude as well, I think.
Yeah. There's few philosophers that talk about eschatology in their writings, and especially in their writings on politics and geopolitics. One is Dugin, which I would assume you know.
I know of him, of course. The truth is, I'm not terribly familiar with his work. If you want to kind of recapitulate some ideas, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. I'm just bringing him up, and I tend to do that often because he's probably one of the few people who actually has a component of explicit eschatology, whereas many, the left doesn't have an eschatology explicitly, but it has implicitly, which is in a way also Kierkegaardianly Christian, doing the right thing, justice, equality. And obviously that going through the phylum of humanism and liberalism and modernity. What Dugin does is he provides kind of another pathway for that salvific story that says that modernity is the Antichrist. And he says that, hey, liberalism and the American humanists, human rights type way is wrong, go to another way, go do the Russian way, the Putin way, which is in itself kind of weird. I don't know. I just love the idea that there's to actually be able to formulate the North Star as an eschatology, as a soteriology, as this doctrine of where we want to go to save ourselves, feels like such an essential thing that not too many philosophies do. And the ones that do might, their accelerationism does that. It's a nihilistic one, but it does that. Dugin does that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good case to be made that modernity is the Antichrist. I mean, it does seem to match very closely, essentially, what is laid out in the Faust myth, and I think Heidegger diagnoses it a bit in the question concerning technology. I think that's essentially what's going on. Of course, Heidegger doesn't say it's the Antichrist, but you do get this idea that pretty much what happens at the dawn of modernity, what really sends us off into modernity. And for people listening who don't quite know this, perhaps, most of human history was stagnant. Economic growth is pretty much almost negligible for the overwhelming majority of human history. It's only really around the Industrial Revolution that all of a sudden economic growth becomes a thing. And if you look at this on a graph, it's basically a very, very long straight line close to zero. And then all of a sudden, around the time in the Industrial Revolution, that line shoots up. And then economic growth happens, modernity happens. So it really is this profound and specific rupture in the course of human history that is rather extreme. And I interpret that essentially as you only kind of get that power through a bargain with the devil. And that's essentially what's happened. And now, as things accelerate digitally and technology becomes, it seems to be changing things fundamentally in ways that we can actually feel in a way that is kind of vertiginous for us. That's essentially we're kind of watching the devil coming to claim his debts, I think.
I think one of the other things that shines through in Dugin's political philosophy is this idea that globalism is also a manifestation of the Antichrist, and that a way to return to a more spiritual and Christian, I guess he would phrase it, way of being is this more multipolar world, he calls it, where America is no longer the hegemon and where power is distributed much more through the East and through Asia, and America has really lost its seat at the top. I wonder, as a political scientist, what your thoughts are on where we may be going in terms of geopolitics.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a difficult one. Forecasting complex international phenomena is notoriously difficult. So, I think it is in the nature of complex systems to be pretty much unforecastable by humans within those complex systems. It's almost the definition of a complex system that one cannot infer where the system is going to be a few steps forward. So, with that as a caveat, that I would urge everyone to be super, super skeptical of geopolitical forecasting at any type of pretended level of granularity. We can nonetheless, it is interesting and worthwhile to speculate a bit on some of the tectonic shifts that seem to be happening. In my view, I mean, it is important to remember that America is still the global hegemon by far in terms of military power projection. So that's something to keep in mind. China is a rising power for sure, but they still don't have anywhere near the same kind of ability to project military force around the world like America does. Nowhere near. So there's still a huge gap there. Russia, is obviously a large country. They're resource rich, but it's still an extremely poor country. And I'm interested in kind of Russian anti-modern philosophies. I'm curious and I guess there's some possibility that by retaining a kind of traditional set of values and culture and not allowing modernity to, sink its teeth into Russian civilization, that somehow kind of Russia will remain a powerful, strong society. But I mean, economically, they're not a wealthy country. And frankly, there's this idea in the political science literature of what they call the resource curse. And so when countries when authoritarian rulers can retain power, in large part because of a lot of natural resources, which is in a large part the Russian case, a lot of the power and the economic power and the political power of kind of the ruling class in Russia is linked to the huge territory that Russia represents and the natural resources in that territory, oil in particular. But they're not a rich country. They're not a they're not a particularly powerful military force in their ability to project power over, around the world like the American military can. So, I mean, I wouldn't really, frankly, I would not yet put my money on China or Russia really becoming a new hegemon replacing the American one. I think China probably it's more worrisome. There's also this idea I think China's more worrisome for this question than Russia, because of China's unique kind of growth situation and their unique kind of governance situation, which I think is more dynamic and much more compelling than Russia. Now, there is this idea in the political science literature about great power transitions, hegemonic transitions, and it's in fact one of the contexts in which interstate war is most likely is when there's a decreasing hegemonic power and an increasing upstart alternative hegemonic power. So the idea here would be that look, it certainly does seem to me that America is increasingly off the rails. The American political system is increasingly incapable of weathering the storm of accelerating contemporary technology and social problems and biological problems such as pandemics or whatever. So it definitely does seem to me that the American power is probably overextended geopolitically from a lot of costly wars. And the internal situation of just American civilization and American social and political vitality seems to definitely be on the downslide for sure. That does seem to be the case to me, and in some ways, China appears to be on the rise. So you could imagine in the not too distant future, as China becomes more powerful and America becomes less powerful, that there's a serious risk of major military conflict there. So I think that's a legitimate live wire that people should be very worried about. I think in fact the probability of war between China and the United States is much higher than people think, actually, than the average citizen thinks. I think it was the political scientist Graham Allison, who's a very sophisticated China watcher, who argues, I forget the number he put on it, but he believes that the possibility of war between the United States and China right now, or something like, I forget, I'd have to check his book, but he says something like over the next X amount of years, he thinks the probability of war between U.S. and China, a serious war, is somewhere like around 50%. Okay, so I think that's a live wire. I don't know if it's that. I don't know what the probability is, but I think that's a serious live wire. And yeah, that's possible. But frankly, I think there's too much kind of pro-China excitement in the West. I think this is an interesting thing, and this will be my last comment on the question, which is in educated circles in America, there seems to be a real fashion to think China's really cool and impressive, and China's going to take over the global economy. America is stupid, backwater with all of our like traditional concepts of the separation of powers and federalism and all of that. There's this popular, fashionable attitude among high education elites in America who say this and think this. I don't buy that. I'm much more skeptical of China because if you look at the political science research, there's just not much evidence to think that you can have an authoritarian political system and dynamic economic growth indefinitely. So my prediction for China would be that either, and this is just based on everything we know about all political systems in history pretty much, it's either going to keep getting rich and then it's going to liberalize and kind of converge toward the kind of Western, the Western kind of liberal democracy equilibrium that most of the wealthy Western world is in. China's either going to go down that path because it's a strong attractor. That just is how political systems develop, or they're going to retain their authoritarianism and it's going to choke off growth, and they're not going to be able to sustain the high growth rates that they currently have if they choose to prioritize the authoritarian control of the CCP. I think it's probably going to be one or the other. People, I think, are way too bullish on the idea that you can have this kind of authoritarian CCP and super high growth rates indefinitely. I think there's no reason to believe that that's sustainable yet. I mean, maybe they're like a unique thing in the history of governance. But if you're scientific and you look at the data, you should be extremely skeptical of that. But I see a lot of educated people who seem to have a lot of faith in that for I don't know why.
It's precisely on that point that I wanted to start my next question, the educated people. So I saw in one of your videos, you were talking about stored social capital being something that people spend when they're trying to achieve coherence. So if I'm angry at someone else, I'll sit down over an hour, have a beer, and all of a sudden we're spending that quote unquote capital to be able to achieve coherence. As the environment for spending that stored social capital for the purpose of collective coherence becomes disadvantageous, as we're seeing in the United States and in the West, there's a big contrast between the environment in the United States, where social cohesion is at a minimum, and let's say in China, where, through Confucianism and sort of a dictatorship, social cohesion is a different problem that can be almost technically solved, almost. Whereas perhaps on the military front, America still does retain that advantage. The shining star that is American exceptionalism in the minds and hearts of its people is waning because of this sort of longer, quote unquote, fourth generation warfare program that, not to get too conspiratorial, but we can map it by its effects. And we do see extreme polarization, extreme dissonance, incoherence. And so I wanted to throw the following question to you, which is autocults. Autocults being this incredible concept by this guy called Pat Ryan. And it's essentially the idea that social cohesion can be technically solved as soon as we start to map out, using neural networks, how people do sense making and how people engage in cults via a process of like semiotic hacking or designing their very ontologies. You can pretty much solve technically the problem of sustaining social cohesion and scale up the production of stored social capital, which is that thing that didn't scale when the Industrial Revolution hit, right? That ankle point when we started to get a lot of material goods, that was not a point where social cohesion and the idea of God scaled. In fact, that was precisely the point when the idea of God started to wane. Looking at that, looking at China, looking at how China has this different way of sustaining coherence, looking at how special economic zones are set up there. I don't know. All that I'm thinking is that one of the big problems today, and that's precisely something that you like to work on a lot, is coherence, is mediation.
Yeah, I love what you said. I never heard of the thinker that you mentioned, but I'll look into him later. And I really like that idea, and I really drive with that idea. I mean, I've written a little bit in the past about how I think the possibilities for engineering ideal social formations is actually much more available than people think. It's much more possible than people think. And I also think here there's a little bit of what you mentioned before about how in the supreme danger is the saving power also, that famous Holderlin quote that Heidegger brings to bear. I really do see this in the American political context. I mean, I do think that right now it looks on one level like American governance is so terrible, and this is the fashionable educated opinion right now that, compared to China, compared to other countries, the American political system is just utter shit. It's completely broken. The situation in America is so bad, and it's going to keep getting worse. And I'm very cautious about this fashionable idea right now, because the way that I see it is there's a very good possibility that because the American federal government does seem increasingly incapable of dealing with major threats. Like it does seem pretty obvious now that, the US federal government is not going to save us from any type of global catastrophic threat now or in the future. If you look at its handling of the pandemic, that could be the saving power also. In this supreme danger might be the saving power also, in the sense that what is the signal that actually gets sent to American citizens? The signal that gets sent to American citizens is you better get more creative. You better get more self-reliant. You better be ready for the next global catastrophe that the federal government's not able to handle, right? So whereas like the typical average Chinese citizen right now is kind of maybe they're feeling like, oh, wow, this is nice having an authoritarian communist party who will literally lock people in buildings against their will if they might be contagious with a virus or something like that. Right now, in this current moment, maybe the average Chinese citizen feels, proud of their government and feels confident that, the CCP has their interests at heart and is going to take care of them as China grows into the future. But is that really the ideal mental state that you want your citizens to have? I mean, I think in the American context, what you could very well imagine is that because of this wake up call of the failed governance response to the pandemic, it's going to send the millions and millions of smart, interesting, creative people in America, it's going to send them into high gear. It's going to put a fire under their ass to change their lives even more, to take new risks, to create new systems, to create new structures, to create new organizations and communities that are going to be possibly even better at becoming anti-fragile to global catastrophes. So I think there's a very decent possibility that over the next 20 years, 50 years in America, the federal government keeps getting shittier and shittier and less kind of powerful and effective, which frankly, from a certain perspective, maybe is a good thing, given, especially from a social justice perspective, if you think like, if you think basically the kind of crony capitalist US government elites are in large part a force for evil in many ways. Or if you're a kind of right-leaning libertarian type who thinks that, the U.S. government is mostly just a kind of theft machine. Either way, there are reasons maybe to be happy about the federal government kind of slowly losing any type of power or relevance at all. And what could very well happen is you see a huge upsurge in kind of community-based, local-based creativity and technological applications. I'm imagining like, well, take me for instance. I'm already thinking very hard right now about like, how can I maybe create my own like community in, I don't know, like the fucking mountains of Montana or something like that. That's like has super good Wi-Fi. It's like super technologically up to speed. It's like all of the benefits of modern urban living. But maybe there's a way that I can just make it for me and my friends in somewhere that's like fortified geographically and totally autonomous and is better than anything currently available as a life option right now. I'm already thinking about this because right now I'm stuck in a fucking house and I haven't left it in like several months. And frankly, if this is going to happen again, I don't want to be stuck in like a normal house. I want to be living with 100 people somewhere beautiful in an autonomous city where we can like do our own crazy, interesting, liberating technological and social experimentation. Like the pandemic is making me really get more serious about how I can take calculated risks to bring that type of future into being. And I think if that happens to other American people, there's a very good chance that in the not too distant future, America becomes this amazing dynamic patchwork of local, technologically sophisticated, but also more kind of community based, trad values based, more cohesive communities. In large part because we have to respond to the inability of centralized governments to do that. And if that happens, I think there's a very good case to be made that in 100 years, you'd rather be in America, living in my community in like the mountains of Montana or something like that, than hooked up to crypto and all this kinds of other shit that at least we're able to do because we have the freedom to try it, than to be like an average Chinese citizen. I think it's possible. I wouldn't put a lot of money on it, but it's possible. And that's the vision that I would like to encourage people to focus on. That's
a good answer to the problem that I was about to point out as kind of a sort of counter argument, or like in a playful way, trying to see what you would come up with in response to this. And this is my final question, which is, will it be easy to achieve coherence amongst a population that is increasingly radicalized, especially and mainly because of technological and capitalist reasons? Meaning that it kind of plays to it's kind of the dark underbelly of what you were mentioning as a potentially positive scenario, the fragmentation and atomization. It might lead to a beautiful patchwork of city-states which somehow cohere and don't engage in conflict amongst themselves. But what we're seeing is a trend towards kind of an opposite side, towards division within the sort of body of American politics and population. And also, I mean, the capital presupposes a mode of relating with experiences and existence. And that mode of relating with experience and resistance doesn't does it have our best interests in our mind as previously God would have had?
Right. So great questions. I mean, I do think that you are going to see more and more inequality in terms of social community quality and mental cohesion. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that right now that people's brains are being fried at a crazy degree. I mean, myself included. I'm not putting myself above that. I mean, just the current technological, social, techno-social, if you will, context of human life is accelerating and kind of it's short-circuiting us in ways that we don't even fully understand. It's taking out the sense-making capacities from underneath our feet in ways that we don't even fully realize. And you have a ton of very smart people, capable people, good people who are basically spinning their wheels like crazy on the internet, on Twitter, doing this and that, and making no sense and producing extremely undesirable, unpredictable outcomes that they don't even really want to be producing. And if that is true, I think things are going to start to bifurcate. There are going to be people who wake up to this and realize, oh, the entire context of normal human life is changing. And if we want to thrive, if we want to not just survive, but thrive, that we need to start getting super creative about re-engineering everything around us, re-engineering our friendships, our relationships, our technologies, our communities. And people are going to go all in on creating new, better, very novel systems for living, I think. And some of those people will do well doing that. Some of those people will succeed. Some of those people will fail. But trying and failing is not that bad because you can quickly just copy what starts to work, right? So if there's a proliferation of experimentation and one pilot project takes off and does really well, if my pilot project fails, it's not that big a deal because I'm paying attention. I'll just switch to what's working. Nice. The real threat or the real problem, the fear, is all of the people who are just going along like normal in a context where normal is no longer available. And yeah, I think those people will increasingly find themselves in despair. And sorry, there's some knocking here. There's some work being done at the house. Those people are going to find themselves increasingly confused, increasingly despairing, and they're probably going to become increasingly desperate also. And you're going to see more and more violence and rioting and these types of things, probably, possibly. I mean, I don't know how I put a confidence interval on that, but I would expect for large numbers of people who try to just basically keep spinning their wheels in the same old way, it's going to get worse and worse for them. But what then will happen is, ideally, the people who figure out good ways to live are going to have to reach out a kind of olive branch to all the people that are suffering. So I think about it as like smart, creative, and courageous people have to create life rafts for building their own effective communities that can navigate this bottleneck that we're going through. And they need to actively be welcoming all the normal people who are falling into desperation and crazy life. And frankly, there will be choices. Like, it will be possible for the lost people to like get on board with other things that are working. But it's going to be up to the people who are lost to admit that they're lost. And this is like, again, where the Christian perspective really kind of comes into play in a way that I think is not just like, it doesn't just sound nice. It's not just like a mystical thing. It's actually rational and actually really communicates real concrete things going on, which is that, there are, like, if you look at the craziest people on the radical left who are like most obviously unhinged and just saying actually really stupid things, and their lives are really not going well for themselves, and that's something no one wants to talk about. But a lot of the vocal, people on the radical left, their whole lives are actually in really bad disorder. No one ever talks about that. It's seen as like below the belt to say that, but that's important data to pay attention to. Like people like me who kind of like leave all the stupid bullshit, and I'm like, yo, you guys are crazy, and you're going to keep downward spiraling if you keep trying to subscribe to these like idiotic ideas. People like me, I go off, I'm like, okay, fine, I'm going to do my own thing. And I'm so far, I'm like doing pretty well. And I'm confident I'm going to like find out a way to live and thrive. And I've like gathered a lot of people around me to do that. And so things are looking up for me. And I'm sure for you folks too, like there's a lot of people like me. I'm not saying I'm special, but I'm just saying as things work out for me, I stay in touch with like my old friends from the radical left who I think like, took the wrong pill and kind of like really went gung-ho on really self-destructive ideas and practices. Like I reach out to them, I'm like, I can help you, right? Like I have a lot of ideas. I have things that are working out. You can be a part of it. Like you don't have to be stuck in that rut. And it's up to those people to, like, they proudly, and I would say even sinfully, they look at me and they say, no, you're like a reactionary alt-righter now. I'm not doing anything with you. You're bad, Justin. That's their own pride and sin. That is basically, and resentment. That's their prideful, sinful resentment that is basically keeping them locked in a downward spiral, headed straight to hell. And it's up to them to be able to want and to subscribe to the like better ways of living that are available to them. And so this is a difficult thing to talk about, because our modern kind of Western culture, secular atheist culture, like really doesn't know how to talk about any of this. And even I find it difficult to start talking about it. I don't want to sound like some sort of like corny, arrogant Christian or something like that, because it's not the case. But there is a real thing here where like those people who are drowning in their own confusion and being destroyed by technological and social changes that they don't even fully understand, it's up to those people to overcome their own pride and their own addiction to their own kind of slothful, sinful, resentful attitude, frankly. And it's going to be ugly, because a lot of those people are not going to want to do that. They're going to cling to their own pride and their own sinfulness. And people who are healthy and living correctly are going to watch those people suffer and die and in a real sense go to hell. This is just the difficulty of the human condition, I think.
Well, Justin, we've already gone over time, so probably need to let you go. I do just want to signify, actually, though, that I think Pat Ryan would really be worth checking out. He's just done this whole lecture series leading up to this idea of autocults, but his conclusion was pretty much a Girardian Christian Jesus built into some kind of... I wasn't actually there, but Daniel was there. But given your own Christian background and the fact that you're in this space, I think a conversation with him would be very fruitful.
Yeah, I would love to. I'd be more than happy to. And I always love hearing about new thinkers that I don't know about. This has become something I've been really obsessed with, trying to get my finger on everyone out there who's interesting and maybe not well known yet. So I love tips like that. Thank you.
Fuck yeah, man. Anywhere, do you want to let people know where they can find you?
I'm all over the internet. I'm on Twitter, J Murphy with no U. My main kind of platform is called Other Life. You can check out theotherlifenow.com. You can subscribe to the Other Life podcast wherever you get your podcast. And the one thing I'm doing right now, one of my major initiatives, is I'm building a private community for other independent intellectuals. I basically created some systems and structures to allow anyone who's working on a kind of long-term creative or intellectual project. I've built systems and structures to really help you do that and to stick with it over time and to get more work done and to get more work done effectively and to be able to have greater impact and do that better and better. So that's kind of in private beta, so I'm not really pushing it publicly yet, but it is up and running. We have a bunch of members and it's really growing, and I'm super pumped on it. Honestly, it seems to really be working, and I'm now pretty confident, honestly, that for anyone who's trying to pursue an independent intellectual or creative project, and if you're struggling with anything, if you're not getting as much work done as you want to, or you're not getting traction like you might hope to, I'm now, after doing Indie Thinkers and building it for about 6 months now, I'm actually now at a point where I'm actually really confident and able to tell people straight up, I really think it can actually help a lot of people who are struggling to do that. It really seems to be working for a lot of people. So very proud of that. And but it's still low key. I'm not even really hyping it or publicizing it too much. But you can check out indiethinkers.org if that's something that people are interested in. And the only other thing is I'm doing a course right now with the British philosopher Nina Power. It's going to be on George Bataille, the French philosopher. And I think it's my second serious kind of online course. And so I'm really pumped on it because I learned a lot the first time around. So now I'm very confident that I can deliver a really, really transformative intellectual, social experience. It's an 8-week thing. It's going to start in July. And so, if you're interested in that, you should be able to find links to sign up for updates without a problem. You can go to theotherlifenow.com/Bataille and you can find more information there. I think that's enough. I don't want to shill too hard,
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really, I appreciate the invite. Thanks for the thoughtful questions. And, I'm always grateful to have an opportunity to rant. So thanks for your patience also.
Thank you so much, man.
All right, guys. Best of luck.